Hello and welcome to the Road to Autonomy. The Road to Autonomy is brought to you in part by Stantec Generation AV. Stantec Generation AV combines some of the most experienced AV experts in the industry with the resources of a global engineering firm. Stantec Generation AV provides education, consulting, assessment, and guidance to any industry interested in autonomous vehicles. Learn more at stantec.com. Hello and welcome to the Road to Autonomy. I'm your host, Grayson Brulte. On today's episode, we're absolutely honored to welcome back Alan Ohnsman, Senior Editor Forbes. Welcome back to the podcast, Alan.
Hi, Grayson. Thanks for inviting me on.
Excited to have you here. As always, you do a really great job of covering the mobility industry, and lately you've turned your attention to an all-electric future. And when I say all-electric future, that will be a future with hydrogen because there's not a one-all-size solution to decarbonizing transportation. And today, Alan, we're on the road to an all-electric future, yet we have a shortage of mined raw materials and a lack of refining capacity to enable this future. How did this happen?
That's a great question. If you think like what was the main issue, it's probably that the push to shift to EVs happened faster than any of the major OEMs anticipated. You've had Tesla really beating the drum on this topic for the last 16 years. They were a niche player for quite some time. And then suddenly, within the last 5 years or so, their volumes are picking up. Then you have policy that begins shifting towards doing things to mitigate carbon pollution. Honestly, many of the OEMs were just caught flat-footed. They were not prepared to reset operations and redesign things in this way because the scale of what needs to happen is huge, and all the things you need to line up to make that happen are huge. So traditionally, you'd want to find all the mechanical parts and electronics you would need for conventional gasoline-powered cars. Suddenly, you've got to start thinking about trading companies and mining companies and all of these different commodity metals and minerals that come from all over the world, very few of them from the US or within North America right now, and thinking, oh man, we need a lot of this stuff. We need it fast. Where are we going to get it? So I think the industry was generally caught flat-footed in terms of the pace of the transition. I think they knew it was coming, but I don't think it was expected to come quite as quickly as now policy is pushing it to happen.
I'll put some numbers to this because the price of lithium, a major key ingredient for EVs, according to benchmark materials, is up 122% year to date. That's a massive increase. And then on the backside of that, to the OEMs, we saw Tesla flirt with bankruptcy several times. So they think, oh, this is going to be a fad. It's going to go the way of the EV1. Tesla's going to fail and long live the internal combustion engine.
Yeah, I think there's something to that. I mean, Toyota would probably be the best example of a company that thinks very long term, is somewhat conservative, and generally makes solid bets. But in this case, it turns out that their bet was not quite as good as they would have hoped. Toyota was banking on the hybrid model where you're getting much better fuel economy, lower overall emissions by using hybrid systems, initially with nickel metal hydride batteries and then later lithium ion. Those battery systems, though, don't require that much raw material relative to, say, a pure EV. And I think generally the industry view was through constant improvement in fuel efficiency and thermal efficiency and better combustion cycles and using hybrid technology and maybe some plug-ins, that really could go a long way towards meeting the demand for vastly more fuel efficient, less polluting vehicles. But it turns out that was just not enough, that both the market, regulators, there is this push to say, no, we've got to get to zero. We've got to do it quickly. We've got to do something major on carbon emissions from transportation. Electricity is the way to go. And of course, right now, it's about a quarter to 30% of carbon emissions in the U.S. do come from transportation. So that's why it is such a big focus of a lot of the new regulations. But I think what you're seeing with the run-up in prices for especially lithium would be exactly that. There was not a lot of advanced planning, and now suddenly, whether it's General Motors or Ford or VW and everyone else saying, we need lots of this stuff, we need it now. Well, it's supply and demand. The price is going to react to that when the demand suddenly spikes. And so that's what we're seeing with lithium and cobalt and nickel and really all the commodity metals.
We're seeing the demand spike with the prices. The prices for the consumers effect, and the average price of a new electric vehicle in the United States is $66,000. That's out of reach for a majority of Americans. Does that create an opportunity for hybrids to slide in there as a consumer says, I would like to go to a greener future. However, I can't afford an electric vehicle, but I can afford, say, a used Prius or a used RAV4. And does that create an opening for Toyota, say, for the next 2 to 3 years to gain market share and increase revenues?
To some extent, I think that high price in the marketplace actually really is just the Tesla effect. Tesla is nowhere near the mass market. Its cheapest, a base model, Model 3, with no options at all before taxes is basically $50,000. Once you add on autopilot and other features, you're going to be in the high 50s or 60 with tax. And the Model Y has been their top seller, and the Y now starts at basically $60,000. So because their market share is just so big right now in the EV space, they still control, like, I forget what it is, 2/3 to 3/4 of EV sales. Not for much longer, but right now that price you see really reflects the Tesla effect. The good news is there is a lot of much more affordable product out there. The Hyundai and Kia EVs are quite compelling, and they start in the high 30s, low 40s. You can get a version of the Chevy Bolt EUV currently for less than $30,000. Chevy has a very attractive new version of the Equinox coming soon. Base price for that is right around $30,000. So there is going to be a lot more product available at those mass market prices. And that's going to be one of the most interesting changes, I think, over the next couple years, where Tesla has made a decision that they like high profit margins. They've got plenty of demand. And so there's really nothing pulling them into the mass market. They want to stay where they are. And they've basically become the best-selling premium brand in the United States as a result. But that now leaves a lot of opportunity for General Motors, Ford, VW, Hyundai, Kia, all the other competitors to come in at a more mass market price. So that's going to be a big part of it. But I think you're right. I think Toyota has really refined a hybrid technology. I mean, the Prius is quite good. The plug-in Prius gets you 25 miles of EV range, and then you're just driving a Prius after that, which gets 55 miles per gallon. So that is a more effective, attainable vehicle for a lot of people. And so, yeah, the hybrid piece is going to stick around for a while. That's not going to be good enough in a place like California. In 2035, you can't sell any new gasoline car here in the state of California 13 years from now. So as a result, everything is going to go electric. And those market forcing measures out there are going to change things. It is going to be tough, I think, in some cases for lower income folks to get into these vehicles. There is a lot of assistance at the federal level in terms of incentives, and California provides some additional incentives. I don't know if those are sustainable over the long term. You can do it for a few years, but if it's millions of people or tens of millions of people who want these things, that gets to be pretty expensive pretty fast. So prices will have to come down. And we get back to your earlier point. The challenge is as demand for the vehicles goes up, sales goes up, demand for those materials, the raw materials, the lithium, the cobalt, the nickel, continues to rise. So even if all things being equal, you could make a cheaper battery because you've improved the technology or the way you manufacture it, those market prices are going to keep pushing against that. And it's going to be very hard to really get a really low cost EV to market. That's going to be a real challenge for the next decade.
You reported this in one of your Forbes articles that it's reported that we have a lack of 384 mines for graphite, lithium, nickel, and cobalt. Then we have the lack of refining. If we have such a large lack of mines, 384, as you point out in your reporting, how are we going to drive that price down? That's a lot of demand that has to be filled to drive the price of the EV down.
That is a good question. I mean, prices went nuts at the start of the year for nickel, for example, because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the war there, because Russia's a major supplier of nickel. So suddenly that particular material got far more expensive, and that had very little to do with EV demand. It is a real challenge. That figure, that 384 mines, that was Benchmark Minerals in London, which did that estimate. And the point they're making is if you look at the scale of demand and where it's going to be throughout the 2020s and into the 2030s, we're not ready. We need far more sources of supply. There is stuff out there. There is material in the earth. Supposedly, it might be at the bottom of the sea. Maybe it's on asteroids. There is stuff out there, but we're going to have to figure out ways to get it that are affordable and ideally not really environmentally harmful. Lithium is probably the easiest of those. There's a lot of lithium everywhere. It's just not scaled for production in a lot of places. Latin America or South America and Australia have big lithium mining operations. We might have some that are promising here in the US. There's lithium all over the place. So lithium is probably going to be the easier option to solve. But nickel and cobalt, we need more graphite and manganese and all sorts of things and new sources of supply. So identifying where large quantities of those minerals exist, and then how can they be extracted in ways that are not horrible for the environment? Because mining is not historically, it's not a great thing. It does destroy topsoil and groundwater, and there's pollution and runoff, and the tailings can be bad, and there are a lot of negatives related to mining. The human cost for miners, inhaling fumes and dust that can provide all sorts of lung disease and different problems. So mining is a tricky thing. There are companies that are trying to do it in more ethical and environmentally sensitive ways, but it's not a simple thing. So I'm not sure I know what the answer to the question is. I mean, how are we going to do it? Are we going to be able to find all the materials? I'm sure there are a lot of mining experts that will tell you how it can be done. I'm not 100% certain it can be done without some problems, some real challenges.
There's a lot of challenges, but there's also deposits. And you recently took a trip out to the Salton Sea. There was the old thing. That's where you go to escape the IRS. It's about an hour outside of Coachella. And you document it in an absolutely brilliant piece for Forbes magazine on August 31st titled, "California's Lithium Rush for EV Batteries Hinges on Taming Toxic Volcanic Brine." Well done on the article. You captured all of the potential pitfalls, but you talked about the positive implications if it happens. After visiting the Salton Sea, doing an immense amount of research, what are your thoughts on potential Salton Sea that Governor Newsom has called the Saudi Arabia of lithium? Is it possible?
We're going to find out. It is one of the most interesting projects out there. It is potentially one of the largest deposits of lithium in the world, but it exists in a different form. There's lots of lithium that can be found in different types of salty brines all over the world. In South America, in Chile, and places like that, that's already where it's coming from. The difference in the Salton Sea is beneath the Salton Sea, you're on top of volcanoes, underground volcanoes, and this incredible seismically active part of the world. And already there are several, 10 or 11 geothermal power plants that are tapping into this brine. It comes from 6,000 to 8,000 feet below ground, so a mile and a half underground. Super hot, 600-degree brine. You drill down to get to this stuff, the pockets of it. It's forced up. They're taking that brine today and running it through geothermal power plants to make clean electricity. That all seems great. And then the idea is, well, hey, that brine is full of lithium, and it's also got manganese and some other interesting metals we might be able to extract. It's win-win. What's not to like about this? Well, it turns out that it is very challenging because in addition to having lithium and manganese and good things, it's also got arsenic and lead and a lot of toxic stuff and maybe low-grade radioactive material. So as a geologist I spoke to said, it's a virtual periodic table of elements of what's in that brine that's been made fresh from volcanoes underground. It's coming in hot and it's full of bad stuff. So the real challenge now is this is not just a traditional salty brine. It's one that has a lot of good stuff and bad stuff at the same time. So you have to have a very sophisticated process to separate out just the things you want. You want to get that lithium, you want to get the manganese, and you want to make sure that it doesn't have too many impurities in it so that you can refine it into a form, lithium carbonate or lithium hydroxide that can be used for batteries. So you need to make sure you're getting a nice clean stream of lithium that you can work with and not the bad stuff in there. This is not an easy thing to do. The heat of the brine is a problem and you have to manage that. And then you also have to make sure that at no point are you letting any of that bad toxic stuff get out of your facility and into the open air, because the Salton Sea, in addition to being a tax haven for some, as you pointed out, also has a very serious health problem right now. The Salton Sea is like a miniature Great Salt Lake, super salty, and it's shrinking. It's very toxic. The water already is very toxic from agricultural runoff. And as the Salton Sea's shrinking, it's exposing this playa bed. What was the muddy bottom is being exposed. That muddy bottom is full of really bad toxic materials. It's blowing around and is linked to serious health problems for people living in and around that region. So there's already stress on human health from what's happening that has nothing to do with lithium. So now if you come in and you begin trying to tap the brine that's coming up for the geothermal plants and get lithium out of that, it may be doable, but you also have to make sure that it's a complete sealed system and that at no point you're not releasing any additional toxins that would further make that area just not the best place for humans to exist. There's lithium there for sure, no question about it. It's just actually getting large quantities of it that are usable to make battery cathodes is to be seen. There are 3 companies that are going to begin doing this reasonably soon. One, Energy Source Minerals, is beginning construction now of their first facility. That will be the first to open. And so they're going to be the real test case. And by 2024, they've got pretty ambitious goals in terms of how much lithium they think they can capture and sell. It may work, but this has never really been done before. Getting lithium from brine is not a new thing. Getting lithium from this particular type of brine is completely new. It has a lot of challenges. It's going to be fascinating to see. If it works, it's so beneficial for everyone because it would be a more environmentally sustainable way to do this, since you're just tapping in to a stream that already exists. So strip mining, it's not tearing up the environment to do something new. You're really just glomming on to something that's already happening there in terms of the brine that's shooting up into these geothermal plants. So that's going to be one to watch, but it's also a huge question mark. I think we've mentioned Benchmark Minerals in London. They watch the market very closely. They're really not factoring in a significant portion of Salton Sea lithium anytime soon. They think it's a possible significant source over time, but they're a little pessimistic that within this decade, there's going to be a significant amount of new lithium coming in from that part of the world.
Also, Berkshire Hathaway Energy's operating there, Controlled Thermal's operating there. The brine's 600 degrees, repeat, 600 degrees. From a cost perspective, you mentioned the dust, and you had a photograph in your article in the magazine, and it showed the rust that this equipment doesn't last long because of the environmental impact. Is that going to make it more expensive to extract lithium out of the 600-degree brine than it would be to operate in, say, Chile in the Atacama Desert?
Well, right now, there is a reason why Chile is one of the big centers for this, because it is much lower cost. Lower cost labor, lower cost everything. It's a simpler process. At the same time, that has its own issues because it's very heavy water use in a part of the world that may not have that much to spare. So again, the developers in the Salton Sea of those projects, they do believe it's going to be very competitive over time. But that probably suggests that the first 4, 5, 6 years of operation, it's likely to be higher cost. General Motors is working with Controlled Thermal on one of those projects, and they are optimistic about it. And the reason why they like the project is they believe that the overall environmental impact will be far less harmful from that process. But again, until it's proven out, we won't know. The geothermal plants, as you point out, they look much older than they are. And it's because that brine is really corrosive. I mean, I was reading an old Caltech report from the 70s, because it's been known for a long time that the potential of that brine. But the researchers in this terrific report from the 70s were pointing out that that brine will eat through steel and concrete. This stuff it's really destructive. So these geothermal plants have to be set up with copper line tubes and all sorts of materials that are less subject to scaling and the corrosive power of that brine. But even so, this is why geothermal power there is expensive power, because it's clean and green, but the constant upkeep and maintenance required in reinvestment in those geothermal plants is consequential. So if you look at wind, you look at solar, and then geothermal, geothermal is great because it's always on, it never stops. It's 24/7, nonstop, cranking out power, cranking out power. The problem is you build a big solar field, a big wind farm, your maintenance is not that high. You don't have to do that much. Geothermal, you got to do a lot. You got to make sure that all those pipes are clean, that everything's working, and you're constantly sort of renovating and repairing the facilities. It's this Rube Goldberg kind of collection of pipes and tubes and chambers where the brine flows through. And it's fascinating. And it is good for us that we're getting lots of clean power in that way, but it's not the cheapest option by any stretch.
It's not the cheapest option. It's unproven. We haven't been able to prove that we can extract the lithium in a meaningful way yet. But yet the state of California has proposed a flat rate tax on lithium that would impose a tax of $400 per ton for the first 20,000 tons of lithium produced annually, then $600 per ton for the next 10,000 tons. And then this is California, we're not done yet, and $800 per ton with output of 30,000 tons or more. Mining companies are throwing their arms up in the air saying, we haven't even proven this yet. You want to tax us. We don't know what the profitability is. We don't know if we're going to be able to scale this. And then meanwhile, you've got Nevada over there that knows the LLC loophole, raising their hands. Hey, we've got lithium. Come invest in Nevada. Is this a classic case of California shooting itself in the foot?
There's a lot of discussion about the decision on taxes, and that was finalized, I think, in the current state budget. And to your point, it is a little interesting that that's already been spelled out before there's any proven commercial viability at this point. The motivation for that is the Salton Sea area is incredibly poor. It's one of the poorest parts of the state of California. And also, there has been for some years this ongoing struggle to figure out how can the Salton Sea be cleaned up. The taxes that are being levied on this potential new source of lithium, it would be filtered right back into Salton Sea cleanup and for projects there. So the motivation is the right one, I guess, in terms of doing something beneficial. But to your point, it's happening in advance of actually proving that this works. If they perfect the technology, the tax is probably not that big a deal as time goes on. But in those critical early years, it is a problem, and it will add to the expense of what's already a fairly complicated thing. So the mining companies that are doing this, their extraction companies rather, they're not happy about it. And yet they are still moving forward with plans to do it, because I think the market price being what it is, they may be able to eat that tax, but we'll see. I don't know that it's necessarily going to help Nevada, but the optics on it aren't great. But I understand why they did it. I just think the timing is weird. And I think putting that tax in advance of actually showing that this works, it's going to be a meaningful source of revenue. I don't know that that was the wisest move.
I agree with not the wisest move. There's a professor from University of California, Riverside projecting $1 billion a year in tax revenue from this. That's way out there. That's getting all these hopes, and politicians are already spending money before they have it. That's scary from a budget deficit standpoint.
I think that is really like getting over your skis kind of thing. It's like, wait a second, those projections, they're very theoretical at this point. Until direct lithium extraction in the way that they're proposing it is proven and it works and it's scalable. Think about taxing it once it actually exists and is happening. It doesn't right now. It's still basically pilot project, laboratory scale. It is not commercial scale yet. It may be in 2024. There's some desperation in that case for money that could be used to do some beneficial things, because the Salton Sea is a crisis, separate from the lithium thing. There is a public health crisis there. Poverty rates are bad. And there's a broader thing. The Salton Sea is a major way station for migratory birds that have used it for ages and ages. If it's shrinking and the fish are dead, the birds don't stop there. So what happens to these migrations of birds moving back and forth between Mexico and the US and Canada? It is a very complicated thing. And again, I think sometimes in the desperation to solve a thing, you see a potential new source of money, you jump on it, even though it would be wiser probably to hold off and wait and see how things develop first.
That would be wise, but they're politicians. Let's go back. How did we get here? Years and years ago, the Salton Sea was a tourist destination. Hollywood celebrities would go out there. They'd water ski. There was hotels. There was restaurants. It was lively. How did it become toxic?
Speedboat capital of the world. Speedboat racing was a huge thing there too, because that high salt rate means the boats float a little higher on the water, so you could run your speedboat really fast. The toxicity comes from the lack of fresh water coming into it. So the All-American Canal from the Colorado River made agriculture possible in the desert. So that's the other sort of head scratcher. When you drive around that area, even though it's deserty, you will see farms, and they're growing hay and alfalfa and other crops. And the runoff from ag chemicals rolls into the Salton Sea and just accumulates over time. When it was getting more freshwater input from the Colorado River, that would help sort of dilute things a little bit. Once that source was no longer available, then the salinity just gets worse and worse, and the toxicity from the chemical buildup just gets worse and worse. So already much of the fish life is dead. The Salton Sea is remarkable when you see it because it is this enormous, it's the largest lake in California, huge desert lake when you see it, this body of water. Very beautiful, but the beaches are empty, no one's there. It's a ghost town. I mean, you see old 50s diners and motels, just the remnants of them, and it's sort of ghost towny feel all around it because it just could not support the kind of tourist activity it used to into the 70s, I think, when that was sort of the tail end of it. It was not managed well as a resource until it was too late. And so there is some desperation to figure out how can this thing be fixed? How can it be saved? How can it be made better? And that is a big challenge. Lithium looked like the best option for this. But at the same time, what I learned from people who've been tracking this for a long time, in the 80s, they thought geothermal power was the solution. We're going to set up all these geothermal power plants, and those are going to be great, and they're going to generate all this electricity that we can sell, and that'll be a source of revenue. Well, that was before they figured out, oh, the geothermal plants are incredibly expensive to maintain and operate, so there's really no power coming from that. There are money coming from that. There is going to be an expansion in geothermal energy there because the state of California wants more consistent baseload electricity from green sources on the grid. Berkshire Hathaway is the biggest operator of geothermal plants there. They've got 10. They're going to be expanding and putting up more of these geothermal plants. So the area, regardless of what happens with lithium, it is going to be a bigger producer of electricity fed into the grid from geothermal sources. So there's going to continue to be development there. And that means, hey, great, more brine, more potential source of lithium we can tap. But it's solving that challenge of, can this be done? Can we get lots and lots of lithium out of this stuff in a cost-effective way, sell it profitably? We'll know that probably in 4 or 5 years, I guess.
If it happens, it becomes like the old saying, the California gold rush. Salton Sea becomes the lithium rush, and it sets up a mining town.
Yeah, and I think controlled thermal is talking about once they've proven it and are getting relatively high volumes of lithium there, they're hoping that they can convince makers of cathodes and batteries to set up operations there. So you could end up having a major industrial shift for battery production where you get everything from soup to nuts. All your raw materials are available right there, which would be great because that aligns with what the new Inflation Reduction Act is pushing for: more domestic sourcing of minerals, more domestic manufacturing of cathodes and anodes and the batteries themselves. So we'll see whether that takes shape. They've got to prove that they can really get this lithium out of there and do it in an affordable way.
Well, the Inflation Reduction Act has been used as a calling card. Oh, this is going to get American manufacturing for domestic sourcing of minerals. Bloomberg Intelligence argues that the IRA will have a negligible effect on EV sales, accounting for less than 1% of assumed 15 million U.S. automobiles sold annually through 2028, topping out at 1.3% in 2031. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't know how they're calculating that. I would say that I wouldn't expect it to have a major impact for a few years. I think many of the things that it's pushing for will take years to unfold. It's just like whether it's the CHIPS Act or with the Inflation Reduction Act, it's new policies and incentivize these things, but it takes a while to see that happen. You can't set up a mine in a year. You can't build a new battery plant in 6 months. It takes a very long time. And procuring all the minerals and getting them from within North America or from sources that are friendly and allied with the US will take some time. I mean, the underpinnings of this would be China, US competition with China, because China right now really does control the mineral market. It is the 800-pound gorilla in this space. For too long, that was seen as fine and non-threatening when EVs didn't really matter to that extent. Now that they're becoming front and center for US policy, for manufacturing policy, for carbon mitigation policy, it is not the best idea to be entirely reliant on one country to supply so much of that. So this isn't that China mines everything. It's like all of the refining, so much of the refining of lithium, for example, it's all happening in China. Anode and cathode production, it's happening in China. Everyone is sourcing there. I mean, Tesla has been very successful in China because it's tapping right into a lower cost supply base for batteries and battery materials in that market. So that's a real cost savings for the company that really benefits it and is one of the reasons why its profitability has been more solid the last couple of years since it brought its Shanghai plant online. But over time, clearly, it's not necessarily the best idea for the U.S. to be excessively reliant on a country that we have really frosty relations with, and which obviously could get worse if something happens in Taiwan.
The Taiwan issue concerns me for a variety of reasons. We have the chips, and that could bring the global economy to a screeching halt. To put some numbers to this, 85% of the world's refining for raw materials goes through China. And then going back, if you look at the early days of China when President Xi first assumed the premiership, China championed their homegrown battery companies, CATL, before that, ATL and BYD, and they started kicking out foreign battery companies and championed them and built this market and then exported to the world. To me, it was a very savvy political move by President Xi that he saw this future of electric coming. He wanted China to own that market. On the other side, how the heck did the global OEMs not see that this was happening when they have on-the-ground intelligence in China as one of the world's largest automobile markets?
I don't know. I mean, I really don't know the answer to that. Interestingly, some years ago, I was talking to a high-level Hyundai executive, and this was when both Hyundai and Toyota were announcing very bullish plans for hydrogen fuel cell. Hyundai was really benchmarking Toyota and trying to catch up to Toyota in hydrogen. The executive did say rather explicitly, China's doing batteries because they just really can't do hydrogen. Hydrogen's too hard. Battery's not hard. They're doing the easy thing. Well, fast forward like 15 years later, and hydrogen is coming, but it's pretty much a battery world at the moment. That was an interesting bet. I mean, one of the companies you mentioned, both BYD and CATL, really went heavy on lithium iron phosphate. And lithium iron phosphate was just widely ridiculed by battery makers, by OEMs for a very long time, because it is so dense and heavy, and less energy dense rather, and heavy relative to lithium ion. The upside is it doesn't burn as easily and it's cheaper. Well, many years later, now we have Tesla that's sourcing like lithium iron phosphate cells from CATL, and BYD has very compelling lithium iron phosphate battery tech that it's supplying to Nuro for its autonomous delivery vehicles and other companies. And that technology now, lithium iron phosphate, has become extremely appealing because it's lower cost, it's simpler, and the safety factor is high. The thermal stability is better. So I don't think that was really anticipated. That looked in 2010, lithium iron phosphate, it didn't look like a smart, sophisticated bet. And everyone was wrong. The Chinese got it right. Hyundai got it wrong. Hydrogen was not necessarily the better thing. It was harder for a reason, because it is hard. Maybe it would have been smarter to have put more effort into battery early on, but they're trying to catch up now.
They're catching up, and they're learning lessons that they should have learned and hired the right consultants or advisors. That if you're going into the world of raw commodities, you're not dealing with ZF and Continental. You're dealing with a group, and I love the term Javier Blas, the Bloomberg Opinion column chooses, swashbucklers. The global traders, they control this. They're not going to say, Hi, VW. We're going to give you a discount. There's a great story in Henry Sanderson's Volt Rush book where VW invited a bunch of traders to a stadium to source cobalt. And they all sit there, and the gentleman comes in a suit and says, okay, what VW discount are you going to give us? The gentleman looks at him and laughs. I'm sorry, we don't give discounts. And VW walks out of the room dumbfounded. They learned the lesson the hard way, it seems, again.
Yeah, and I think right now that's why you're seeing there's been a real uptick in the number of deals being announced from GM, from VW, from everyone else, where they're partnering with metals and mining companies and some of the startups that are promising interesting things like the Salton Sea folks. They're trying to get on the ground floor, I think, for that very reason, because I think that's a good way to frame it. This is not dealing with Magna or Denso or a big global parts supplier. This is a whole different world, and they don't have any particular cachet, that why a metals trader cares more about General Motors than Apple or someone else.
All we have to do is, I'll give Javier Blas another shout out. His book, The World for Sale, is a fascinating read on the global commodities market, is go back to Mark Rich. That became Glencore when they were doing all the stuff in the Iranian embargo. Well, guess what's coming out? All the oil's coming out and they're painting the back of the ships. A lot of those folks have no ethics.
Yeah.
And so VW today, they plan to invest $20.4 billion in 6 new gigafactories in Europe. Is it too little, too late?
Well, not necessarily. What's that saying? The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is today. It's kind of like that. Yeah, in retrospect, should they have done this like a decade ago? Yes. But here's the thing. Setting up a new EV plant, building a new battery plant, that's the easy thing. That's what they know how to do. Sourcing of raw materials, cobalt from the Congo and lithium from Chile and nickel from hopefully Canada, or Indonesia or someplace else. That is a whole different thing. The one that surprises me is Toyota, because Toyota, being a very thoughtful company that takes a very long-term view, and Toyota has an in-house trading company, Toyota Boshoku, that has been procuring metals and raw materials, steel, for Toyota for decades and decades and decades. One would think that they were perfectly set up with everything they needed, since they have their own metals trading company, that they should be able to do this with no problem. But they're behind the curve on this. I mean, Toyota right now, they're playing catch up more than anyone else. They are certainly behind where GM and Ford and VW and Hyundai are at the moment. And that to me is one of the most interesting miscalculations. How did they not see this coming when they have their own commodity, trading arm that certainly would have been noticing what's happening out there in these different trends? Meanwhile, the Chinese lock in all of these long-term supply deals with key suppliers of cobalt and nickel and lithium all over the world. How that was just ignored or disregarded for so long is pretty remarkable. I don't have enough insight into why that happened or the kinds of conversations that were happening as China starts vacuuming up all the raw materials, but there's a good book in that.
South Korea saw it. LG Chem, Samsung SI, SK Innovation, they saw the movement to batteries. They have a very big, prominent role in the global battery trade. And I want to get back to refining for a moment. So Tesla's kicking around the tires of doing a lithium hydroxide refining facility in Texas. If that comes online, do more global OEMs follow Tesla's lead?
Oh, yeah. I think that's going to happen. The domestic refining piece also is probably easier. Refining is not sourcing. So that's just you're taking the raw material and you're processing it. That's also not as challenging. It's just right now, none of it happens here. JB Straubel at Redwood Materials. JB knows the battery business really well. That was a key responsibility for him during all of his many years at Tesla. He's setting up one of the first domestic anode production facilities, and he's also got a big battery cathode facility in the works. Nano, which is using a silica-based cathode material, is also working on its first factory. So we're beginning to see the early stages of some of these core components and materials shifting to the US, but it's going to take some time. GM is working with POSCO, South Korea, in Canada, and they will also have a cathode operation up there. So it's starting to happen. Tesla is the biggest mover because it's the biggest volume EV player at the moment. They're scaled by year end, they should have capacity to do 2 million units. I mean, General Motors wants to be scaled to do a million by 2025. That's where Tesla is now. But at the same time, as everyone keeps expanding so quickly, and because of the new US regulation on where those materials should come from, you will see a lot more such facilities setting up here, lithium refineries in particular. Texas will probably get a lot of that. Texas, because Texas already does so much in oil refining, it's a technology and it's something that sort of aligns with some of the things that Texas is already good at and is already doing. So oil refining in the chemical industry, areas where you have expertise there, that's probably where you're going to see a lot of these new types of battery materials refineries setting up.
Tesla's seen 105% year-over-year sales growth. It's projected to continue. So they need the refinery, as you clearly mentioned. Other OEMs will need the refinery as well. I agree with you about Texas. The investor Kyle Bass has been buying up a lot of land in West Texas, 1,000 upon 1,000 acres. Perhaps that's a play on refineries. Who knows? But Alan, in your opinion, what has to be done to ensure sustainable electric vehicle supply chain so we can transition to a low carbon, no carbon society?
Well, obviously, fingers crossed that Salton Sea lithium works. That would be helpful. We need massive, massive scale up in recycling. I mean, the reality is we're throwing away so much usable material because there's been no meaningful recycling of batteries, of consumer electronics at all. And right now, the fact that there's not a refund for turning your used batteries back in is insane. That's just idiotic. Just like with bottles and glass and cans that you can return, there should be recycling drop-off spots everywhere, and you get whatever, 5-10 cents a battery for every battery you turn in. None of that. You don't want it in landfill, number one, because it's toxic and it's going to do all sorts of terrible things in a landfill. But also, you're just throwing away something that has actual value. Lithium recycling, it did not make a lot of sense some years ago. No one was really doing it. Now that's changed. Redwood is one example. Lithion and other startups that are getting into this space are doing it. So the last thing anyone should do is throw away an iPhone or anything with a battery in it. And just consumer electronics, in addition to having battery metals, they've got small amounts of gold and platinum in some cases. There are all sorts of things. So we need policy on recycling that really makes sure that all forms of batteries and small consumer electronics are staying out of landfill and are going into recycling, because that is a domestic source of material. And in terms of sustainability, it's hard to beat that one, but it's not enough. Even whatever we can manage to recover from recycling, it's a fraction of what is really going to be needed for all of these new EV batteries. There are suggestions about getting these nodules from the seabed and doing seabed mining and extraction of these nodules that are loaded up with cobalt and nickel and things like that, but risks destroying like aquatic environments and may not really be too great for the environment. I mean, maybe someone will figure out how to mine this stuff off of asteroids and get tons and tons and tons off of asteroids, but I can't imagine in any foreseeable future that that's going to be an affordable option, even if it's doable. It is a real puzzle, and smarter people than me are trying to figure this out. Lithium is probably the easiest of these to solve because there are sources. There's lithium brine in old like oil wells, and there's brine that can be extracted, and you can get lithium out of decommissioned wells all over the place. That's a source. Lithium is quite abundant. It's just not collected currently in large form. I think some of the others are a little tougher. Nickel and cobalt, there's nickel in Canada. Cobalt is in deposits in different parts of the world. Congo's got tons and tons of it. There have been some real issues there with how it's being extracted, like child mines and human health problems. So it is an enormous challenge. I mean, the transition to electricity is important. If there is enough raw material out there, if we can get it in ways that are not horribly destructive for the environment or for human health, I don't know. I think the jury's still out on that. I think at the same time, we have additional technologies like hydrogen. Been some real breakthroughs in production of green hydrogen because of lower cost electrolysis and materials to make that stuff. Maybe we want to see more of a blended future with hydrogen playing more of a role to complement what we can do with battery. I think the other issue is we need to think maybe with EVs, how much range do we really need? if you think about the type of vehicle you're buying, I think Tesla has convinced us that we must have 300, 350, 400 miles of range per charge. And what that also means is a bigger battery, more raw material, and more stress on the grid. Realistically, if we have charging that's ubiquitous and easily available, and you can top off all the time, maybe an EV with no more than about 200 miles max might be better. It's lighter, smaller battery pack, less resource intensive. We're living through an interesting time where a lot of things are going to be tried out. I don't know the exact path, but I suspect we're going to end up with sort of a blended future with a lot of different things. Some smaller, lower cost EVs that are shorter range but can be recharged easily. Longer range EVs for folks that really do need that, for whether it's delivery vans or someone whose job requires them to be on the road and rack up lots and lots of miles, or do things off-road where you need a more robust power system. Hydrogen probably makes a lot more sense for Class 8 semi-trucks, trains, and buses. I think this is going to be a fascinating time to figure out how we solve this. We need to do it. We need to do it fast, because if anyone has been paying attention to the weather this year, climate change is here. It's happening. It's doing all kinds of crazy things. And that is just the reality from now on. We will have wilder storms and more drought and more heat waves, and we've got to figure out how to manage this. Putting out less carbon pollution is key to that. Exactly how we do that, how many EVs, what types of EVs, and where all those raw materials come from, those remain very open and important questions.
Well, we have to solve the raw materials issue. We have to solve the charging reliability issue, because consumers do not trust when they go to point A or point B that the charger is going to work. And that's a whole nother episode that I'll love to have with you later in the year. And Alan, as we look to wrap up this insightful conversation, what would you like our listeners to take away with them today?
Well, I think the key thing is I'm very optimistic about directionally where things are headed. And while we've talked about a lot of things that sound kind of negative or pessimistic, I never cease to be impressed and amazed with the creative solutions that many companies come out with, solutions you didn't anticipate. There is just sort of endless creativity coming from a lot of these companies. I think it is very encouraging. Solving the materials side of batteries right now looks like a big insurmountable problem, but fingers crossed that some new forms of batteries that are less mineral intensive begin to make their way into the mainstream and scale up, which I fully expect over the next 3 to 5 years, that you cut that amount of raw material that you need. I think more recycling and reuse of battery materials. We need to be doing that. I think every state should be set up programs. Consumers are paid to recycle their batteries. The easiest way to get people to stop throwing them away is give them a little money to bring them back. So those are things that can be done now. I'm very optimistic, even though there clearly are a lot of technical challenges and a lot of resource challenges about where we're going to get all this stuff. I think that there will be solutions. I think there will be things that we haven't really anticipated yet. I never cease to be impressed with the creativity out there from engineers and people that are really working on this stuff day in and day out.
There's endless creativity out there. There's great entrepreneurs trying to solve this problem. It's a very bright future, because the future is bright, the future is autonomous, and the future is electric. Alan, thank you so much for coming on the Road to Autonomy today.
Thanks, Grayson.
Thank you for listening to the Road to Autonomy podcast. If you've enjoyed listening, please rate, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Want to get in touch? Follow us on Twitter at Road to Autonomy, or email podcast@brulteco.com. The Road to Autonomy is produced by Brulte & Company. The views and opinions expressed on the Road to Autonomy podcast do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of Brulte & Company. The content discussed on this podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be taken as legal, tax, investment, or business advice.